Saudi-Israeli U.S.-Palestinian peace, is it in the offing? And some hard truths about the left-wing organizers of the protests and the insurrection against the Netanyahu government all came out this week. That and a lot more on my news update. Stay tuned. So the news in Israel and somewhat in the United States has been pretty dominated by another Thomas Friedman deluxe. The New York Times columnist now has presented this idea that the Biden administration and President Biden himself has decided that what has to happen now is that the United States has to mobilize Saudi Arabia on behalf of the PLO. And how is that supposed to work? Well, according to Friedman, the United States and President Biden has sent his representatives to Riyadh repeatedly over the past several months, whether it's Secretary of State Tony Blinken or National Security Advisor Jay Sullivan and others, repeatedly over the past couple of months to try to pursue normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. On the face of this makes sense. Joe Biden is going into a re-election campaign. Doesn't look that great, particularly given what's happening with the congressional investigations about his and his son Hunter's operations with foreign governments and apparent influence peddling, which just seems to get worse and worse for him every day. So, this would be a big win for him, a diplomatic win for Biden going into the 2024 elections if he's able to bring a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But on the other hand, and to that end, his people are going along and meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and with other Saudi senior officials to try to push this idea of peace. But as Biden said in his interview with Fareed Zakaria just a couple of weeks ago on CNN, he said, he doesn't really see any chance he said Israeli-Saudi relations are fantastic, but that he doesn't really see the United States bowing to the Saudi demands from Saudi Arabia sees the United States departing from the Middle East, and it says, look, if you want us to take the risk of making peace openly with Israel, because we essentially have, under the table peace with Saudi Arabia now for going on 10 years, then we're going to need some security guarantees from the United States. We want a mutual defense pact or a United States security guarantee for the kingdom along the lines we had until recently, and we had since 1945. And we want you to develop nuclear power along with us as a response to Iran, which, thanks to you, the Biden administration is at the door of the nuclear club. So those are some of Saudi Arabia's demands from the Americans. And Biden, in that interview with Fareed Zakaria, said no. Who knows? Maybe they're changing a little bit, but what according to Friedman, is really on the table is another way for the Biden administration to destabilize the Netanyahu government. The idea here that Friedman laid out very clearly is that to make a U.S. deal with Saudi Arabia that would include any sort of security guarantee to the kingdom, which the progressive base of the Democrat Party hates because Khashoggi and because they're anti-Iranian and because they're supportive of Israel and so on and so forth. So the progressive base of the Democratic Party hates Saudi Arabia. They despise Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for supporting the Abraham Accords, enabling the Abraham Accords to a large degree, opposing U.S. nuclear diplomacy with Iran, and opposing U.S. efforts to support the Iranian-controlled fiefdom of Lebanon, which it controls through its foreign legion, Hezbollah. So they hate Saudi Arabia for all of those reasons. And the only way that you could expect a progressive base to accept any sort of U.S. concessions to Saudi Arabia or embrace Mohammed bin Salman as a partner is if it came with a price tag for Israel, which they hate even more than they hate Mohammed bin Salman. And so the idea that Friedman put forward was that the administration should or is working with the Saudi Arabians to come up with a laundry list of demands for Israel to meet in concessions, irrevocable if possible, towards the PLO, towards the Palestinian Authority, and that if Israel makes these concessions to the PLO, then Saudi Arabia, and only if it does so, will Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel. So the United States is actually not interested in peace with Saudi Arabia so much as they're interested in, again, destabilizing the Netanyahu government. And I buried that part, which is that here it says that what Friedman argued was that if Netanyahu agrees in to make concessions to the Palestinians in order to satisfy the Saudis and the Biden administration in exchange for formally normalized relations with Saudi Arabia, then that would end the Netanyahu government and compel Netanyahu to accept Gantz's party or Yair Lapid's party as coalition partners, and to replace the religious Zionism party and the Jewish Power Party of Itamar Ben-Gvir. So it would throw out the religious Zionists from the Netanyahu governing coalition and bring in the left as partners with veto power over all of Netanyahu's policies. And so, since that's what the Biden administration seeks, and that's what they've sought for the past 7 months with their open support and efforts to subvert the Netanyahu government by supporting the left's anti-government protests and demonization of Israel. So now the idea is to pivot from the anti-judicial reform, anti-right-wing government insurrection, and move towards this new idea, this new gambit, which is to try to destabilize the Netanyahu government by offering Netanyahu a deal that he can accept only by dismantling his own government and giving the left dominance over decision-making power in Israel in exchange for normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. So the question is, what is the prospects for this actually succeeding? Now, in part, I'm not sure that the Biden administration cares that much if it succeeds, because it gives them something useful to do from their perspective, both in terms of trying to keep Israel and Saudi Arabia apart, because they're it puts Saudi Arabia and Israel at loggerheads on the Palestinian issue, and they want to keep them apart. But also, it allows Biden to maintain his administration's pressure on Israel, even as the government seems to have managed to, at least for now, weather the storm of the left's insurrection with the passage of the initial law in the judicial reform package that it put forward in January. So this is a way to keep the pressure on Israel while doing this. So what are the likely prospects of something like this happening? So I think from the Saudi perspective, it's not clear exactly why the Saudis would want to do this, because just as the Saudis very much wanted for Trump to be reelected in 2020, so they want Trump or another Republican to be elected in 2024, and they want the Biden administration, which is open about its desire to destabilize the regime in Saudi Arabia, to oust Mohammed bin Salman from power, and to embrace and empower Iran as a regional hegemon at the expense of Saudi Arabia. So it's hard for me to see Mohammed bin Salman giving Biden this prize. So I think that's one aspect of it that's important. Would the Saudis abandon Israel? Sure, I think that's possible. I mean, they're looking now at Israel and wondering how stable an ally Israel can be when its internal situation is so chaotic, and the army seems to be continuing its own rebellion against the Netanyahu government. So that casts a pall on Israel's capacity to take concerted action against Iran, which is the main ace in the hole that Israel had for Saudi Arabia. But, I think that they would probably, all things being equal, prefer to see Netanyahu remain in power, with the hope that Israel will actually take action against Iran's nuclear weapons programs and be a strong ally against Iran in Lebanon as well, than have the left come into power and essentially transform Israel, as happened in the previous government, into a satellite of the Biden administration and as another focus for carrying out operations and actions that are antithetical to Saudi interests, like, for instance, the development of the Iranian-controlled gas field in the Eastern Mediterranean, which the United States forced Israel to surrender to Lebanon, which again is controlled by Iran through Hezbollah. So I think, those kinds of things would probably convince Mohammed bin Salman not to agree to that American deal, but, we'll have to see. And insofar as Israel is concerned, I mean, I guess it's possible that Netanyahu would want this deal. He's made no effort to hide. In fact, he's made it very obvious and open. He's been open about his keenness to reach a deal with Saudi Arabia. In many ways, it would revolutionize the Middle East. And this is also an aspect that I think it bears mentioning, which is that, Netanyahu, in his statement on Sunday, he was talking about the government's plan to build a fast railroad that will connect Eilat to Kiryat Shmona in the north, and that he said that it would decrease rail traffic to the center of the country from all points in the country to under 2 hours, in most cases under 1 hour. But the most important aspect of the fast rail that he wants to build is the cargo rail that will transport shipments from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea to the ports of Ashdod and Haifa. And that's extremely important. And what's most important about the rail lines is that we have the project that's been in the works for a while to connect Israel to the Persian Gulf by rail, so that it would go from Saudi Arabia through the UAE, or the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel. And that particular infrastructure project on its own basically changes the whole game economically, not only for Israel and the Arabs, but for China and India, which both operate ports along with the UAE, Dubai Ports World in Haifa, and also for Europe. So now, if we saw, the Wagner Group, right, was apparently behind the military coup in Niger in West Africa, and Niger controls a lot of the precious metals that are going to Europe. For instance, I read this morning 25% of the uranium that goes to France is in Niger. And the new government, which is allied with Russia through the Wagner Group, just announced, the generals, that they were going to end all transfer of uranium from Niger to France. So that's a big problem. So the idea of a safe, dependable transit route for goods, materials, and energy products from the Persian Gulf to Europe through Israel is something that I think the rationale behind it is impossible for anybody to ignore. The interests that all of the parties, not only, again, in the Middle East, but in Asia and in Europe, have seeing this trade route developed is so enormous that without a formalized normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the means can be worked out to enable this project to go forward, because it's just too important to everybody concerned to make it hostage to, an American deal. And by the way, the minute that Israel and Saudi Arabia have informally normalized or formally normalized relations, then to a degree, a lot of the Biden administration's leverage power against both of them evaporates. So I think that the need for or the keenness of the desire for normalization that Netanyahu has expressed is not his alone. I think that a lot of people, again, and people who don't even necessarily like Israel or Saudi Arabia, they share that sentiment, whether in China or in India. And just a word about Egypt. And I talked about this with Dave Wormser after our conversation about U.S. military aid, which is the subject of the Carolyn Glick show. And he's a real expert on trade routes and on materials. And I may have a future conversation with him for this show just on these issues, because it's fascinating. But he said to me, that the idea that Israel and Saudi Arabia need the United States to be to give the imprimatur, to be mediators between them in an age when people are dealing with a scarcity of energy products and of goods, is just, it's no longer true. And the Biden administration's thought that they can come in and dictate an outcome that is not necessarily in the interest of Saudi Arabia, or certainly not in the interest of Israel, is really sort of a throwback from the 1990s. And I think that it's very important to point out again that, that Israel has a very powerful economy, despite the left's efforts to knock it down a notch or two. They haven't been successful at all. But we'll have to see. And then I'll just say that Friedman wrote in his article, which I found amusing. It said that if the Biden team made a deal without a significant Palestinian component, it would simultaneously strike a death blow to the Israeli democracy movement by giving Netanyahu a prize for free after he just did something so anti-democratic, and to the two-state solution, the cornerstone of U.S. Middle East policy. So, yeah, again, so that's where it is. And that brings us really to the democracy movement, which is really the movement of privilege and prestige of leftists who, control so many levers of the Israeli economy and our military and media, and I don't know what else. Anyway, so maybe because the Biden administration is signaling impatience or increased or decreased interest in the democracy protesters who want to, overthrow the democratically elected government. We had a really shocking and disgusting, I would say, op-ed published in the Hill website on Monday. It was written by three of the heads of this insurgency, Gilad Sher, Ami Ayalon, and Orny Petrushka. And I think in a previous conversation with you guys, I talked about the fact that Gilad Sher and Orny Petrushka, according to Gilad Sher, in an interview that he gave on a podcast, I think 2 months ago, he said that he and Orny Petrushka and the former IDF Chief of General Staff, Dan Hayut, and the head of the Kaplan Brigades, Shikma Bressler, and others who are all intimately tied to former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, they met in Petrushka's office in Tel Aviv in December, a month before the government was formed, and 5 weeks before Justice Minister Yariv Levin put out his plan for judicial reform and began organizing all the demonstrations that we're seeing now, because they decided that what had to happen before the government was even formed was that they had to launch a mass protest movement to destabilize it and to paralyze it from the outset. They didn't know what the rationale, the excuse for what they were doing was necessarily going to be. They just knew that as soon as this government was founded, that they were going to start launching these protests. And in fact, the protests began. Yair Lapid went to his first protest while he was still prime minister after he had lost the election. So that, this was going on already. They planned all of this in December. So they write this whole song and dance about how democracy is going to die in Israel and all that in the Hill, when, of course, because of the judicial reform, and they had all their plans together before anybody ever heard of judicial reform, at least the government-specific plans that they've been going to war against and lighting the country on fire to block for the past 7 months. So they have this whole, hand on their heart kind of, we're just going to bare our souls to our American brethren and tell you how much we need you. And among other things, they asked for President Biden not to go through with his plan to host Netanyahu at the White House or meet him. They asked for the United States to isolate the Israeli government and to treat it like a leper in order to save Israel from itself, along with them, to help them to save Israeli democracy by overthrowing the elected government of Israel, democratically elected government of Israel. I mean, the idea that you can go to a foreign power and tell a foreign power, look, we just need your help. We need your help in saving us from our own people, these terrible riffraff who elected this terrible government, democratic, and it's anti-democratic because it's doing things that, that would make Israel closer to the United States. What they're saying to the American people through this article, certainly what they're saying to the Biden administration, and they're also saying to Republicans who read The Hill, is that Israel is a non-functioning state, that the elites in Israel don't want sovereignty. They don't want for the people to choose and for the people to determine the path that this country, that this Jewish state is going to take. They want outside powers to come in and begin leading Israel as if it was a colony or a vassal state of the United States. That's what they seek, and they want to be the viceroy of the American colony of Israel over their fellow Jews in Israel. They don't want their fellow Jews to have the same right to vote as they do, and they're perfectly happy to be an American colony, and at the beck and call of Biden if he'll just let them be in power. And I think that that's so corrupt, and it's really such an insult to the intelligence of the Israelis, and it's also very dangerous for the future of American-Israel relations because this sort of thing, it can be in many different ways. But for sort of an average American reader reading this sort of thing, you can walk away with the idea that, since they present themselves as speaking for the Israeli people when all they speak for is a very tiny sort of layer of Israeli society, the very top echelons of Israeli society that have seized all the power from the people over the years, and they don't want to give it back through a democratic process, people can come away from that with some pretty bitter positions on Israel and on its and on the worthiness of American support for the Jewish state. So I found it all very, very disturbing. And the last thing that I want to talk about just a little bit, is to highlight what Esther Hayut, the outgoing, soon-to-be retired president of the Supreme Court, is doing now. So Esther Hayut announced she cut short her trip to Germany, and in order to muster her posse of justices. And she announced that just weeks before she leaves her position and retires from her position, she wants to have the full quorum of 15 members of the Supreme Court set. They have an automatic, of course, majority for the left, 9, I think, out of 15. And they want to sit down and discuss the petitions or adjudicate petitions about whether or not the law that passed through the Knesset last week that amends the basic law judiciary by limiting its powers to use a concept of reasonableness to abrogate lawful decisions made by the government, by the prime minister, and by ministers of the government. So they want to, they're about to hear petitions saying that the government doesn't have any right to limit the powers of the Supreme Court. Now, there are a couple of interesting aspects of this. First of all, is the conflict of interest just screams to the skies because what the justices are saying is you don't have any right to adjudicate our powers. And that's the whole point of the judicial reform, which is that we now have an imperialist judiciary that doesn't accept any limits on its powers. And so they're coming to the ostensible sovereign of the state of Israel, which is the Knesset and the parliamentary democracy. And they're saying that actually we're the sovereign. And you don't have the right as a sovereign, because you're not a sovereign, to limit our powers. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that the law that was amended is what's called a basic law. And it was the Supreme Court itself, under the leader, the spearheader of the imperialist judicial revolution, Ehud Barak, who determined by fiat, just declared that the basic laws of Israel, which sort of give the underpinning of the regime of parliamentary democracy, with three separate branches of government, the executive, the Knesset, the parliament, and the judiciary, that he said that these were quasi-constitutional laws. They were the basic laws, and therefore they had a special status above the normal laws that were passed by the Knesset. So they're sort of like the foundations of the law of the rule of law in Israel. So it behooves, and the Knesset passes them, right? And it behooves the Supreme Court as a co-equal branch of government to accept that, since Barak himself said that the source of Supreme Court authority is the basic laws and their interpretation of basic laws, that they're not allowed to change those basic laws. They can interpret them, but they can't abrogate them, because that means that they're abrogating the foundation of their own powers, which means that they have no powers. If their powers emanate from the basic laws, then they're canceling basic laws or blotting out parts of basic laws. So what they're saying is that they don't need any source of authority. They just exist in ether, and they flit and float around in the world, and they get to dictate all outcomes in Israeli political and public life. And so this is just hallucinatory. I mean, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for you even to imagine a conversation about such things from in America or in Europe, for that matter. But here it's happening in Israel, and of course, light of the media and of the left, etc., the hordes on the streets of Israel blocking traffic in the name of democracy, and calling for international intervention. So, very importantly, Prime Minister Netanyahu, in a spate of interviews that he gave to the American media in recent days, has repeatedly refused to say whether he would abide by such a judgment from the court. I mean, what the Likud and what Netanyahu said very clearly is, look, there are two bases for the rule of law in Israel. One is the Knesset, which passes laws, and the other is the Supreme Court, which interprets them, and they're supposed to be independent, and they both are equally empowered. But if the Supreme Court is now saying that the Knesset has no such power, then they're destroying Israel's democracy, and that can't be allowed to stand, which is, of course, true. But that's what Esther Hayut wants to do in her final judgment as a Supreme Court president. And so everybody's looking at this and saying we're about to go into a constitutional crisis. I mean, my argument to that is we've been in a constitutional crisis since, at least since the beginning of this government. But really, I would argue over the past 30 years since Ehud Barak began seizing the powers of the government and the Knesset and absconding with those powers with no legal basis, and bringing the Supreme Court into the state prosecution and the Attorney General. So I think, we've been in it for a while, and it's coming to a head. And it's very disturbing looking forward to think about what's going to happen, because, it's a binary choice. If the government obeys the Supreme Court's decision, then we have no rule of law and we have no democracy. And if it doesn't, then we're in an equally chaotic situation, and it's hard to see, given that Hayut is dead set on pushing us to this moment of crisis, how we can avoid it. We'll have to wait and see. So don't forget to be back and watching this show. I may do my news analysis. I can't decide next week because I'm supposed to be on vacation. But if not, then I'll see you a week from now, and we'll be able to get updated on everything that happened in the meantime. And for now, I wish you a good day, a good week, and make sure you subscribe if you haven't yet, and share the message. Take care. Bye-bye.